Okay. So we're gonna pick up with the Shulchan Aruch and Nisei Kalim. We want to do Hey Vav and Zayin in the next hour. And so we're gonna go at a, speedy pace. But there's some really good Nisei Kalim on this. So I want us to be able to look at them, but you know, we'll keep the timing in mind. So picking up with Hey, in Mavatlin. Alish, do you want to start off? You're on mute.
We are in Shulchan Aruch.
Okay.
And 99.
Shulchan Aruch Hey, okay?
Right. Shulchan Aruch, Hey.
אוקיי. אין מבטלין איסור לכתחילה, ואפילו נפל לתוך היתר שאין בו שיעור לבטלו. אין מוסיפין עליו היתר כדי לבטלו, עבר וביטלו, או שריבה עליו, אם בשוגג מותר, ואם במזיד אסור למבטל עצמו, אם הוא שלו, וכן למי שנתבטל בשבילו.
Okay.
So we don't annul the isur like ab initio, like lechatchila, and even if something fell into the heter and the heter is not 60, it doesn't have the strength to be mevatel the isur, so we cannot like lechatchila add the heter in order to make it the ratio bigger. But if someone does it, or right, avar uvitlo, or so we said something that bit right, like so bitlo by adding here probably, right, like so if someone added
Well, take a brief peek at the Taz. This does seem to be on the surface like a repetitive language. Avar ubitlo ushariba
so it's vice
alav.
versa. So is it the repetitive language? Or is it okay? Good. So if it's by
if you intentionally buttled it, then well,
right.
If you
so
it.
If right with law, but if you so if it's beshogeg, so it's mutar. Right. If it's beshogeg, so it's mutar. Right. Mutar. Okay. Ve'im b'mezit, and if it was intentionally asur, so it's forbidden to eat for the one who did the bitul, if it's his, and or alternatively for the one who for whom he does the bitul.
Right, and then read the next bit in parentheses. V'asurim.
ואסורים למוכרו גם כן לישראל אחר שלא יהנו ממה שביטלו. Right, and it's forbidden to sell it to another Jew, so that there is no hana mina isur, no like not enjoyment. What's the word? No profit, right? Like no benefit from the isur. Okay, but for everybody else, it's allowed.
Right, because ultimately, right, as we say, like this is a knas, right? The actual food has been batel. Like the food in front of you is kosher food, right? And so the saying people can't eat it is like shalei haneh, right? That like we think it's bad to do this l'chachila, and so like we don't want you to profit from having done that, But other people, like, who cares? Okay, that's our first seif. And batel is l'chachila. Now, the Taz, I want to look at the Taz Zayin, because he has like a fun little point at the beginning. Yavni, do you want to read in the Taz?
Sure. Which
Zayin?
זין, בסימן פ"ד סעיף י"ג מבואר דאם אין כוונתו רק לדבר אחר, כגון לתקן הדבר מותר.
הדבש.
Sorry. כגון לתקן הדבש מותר. So, yeah. So if you do it intentionally, but the intention is for a different purpose, like to fix the honey, then it's allowed.
Right. So here he does not explain what the tekenet davash is. Look it up. It has something to do with basically some kind of like boiling they would do with honey for like clarifying it or whatever, that I think it would like break up ant bits in it, or like dissolve them. Right. And so I think a clearer example that I saw elsewhere is one where they would like grind wheat and there are like worms in the chitin that are like impossible to separate out. Like you're never going to get all the worms out. And so when you're grinding the chitin, you're also smushing up the worms and bateling them, right? But the idea is that like ein kavanato rak l'davar acher. When I'm grinding up the wheat, I'm not thinking, wow, so nice that I'm smushing up these worms and bateling them. I'm making flour, right? Like there's no other way for me to make flour. And it just so happens that in doing so, I'm bateling the worms. So even if I'm doing that, knowing that's going to happen, right? Like even if it's like as it were, a psikresha that like this is going to be batel, he's saying it would be permitted, right? If my intention was not bitul, right? Siman.
ובסימן קל"ז, סעיף ב', כתבתי, דהיינו דווקא באי אפשר בעניין אחר. So the Taz thinks that only works if there's no other way to get the effect that you are doing it for.
Right, like if you could pretty easily pick out the worms, then you should do that and not grind them into your flour. But like if there's no other way to do it, fine.
Oh, I understood it as אי אפשר the tikkun of the dvash or the...
I think, yes. I mean, like with the flour one,
making of the flour, right?
There's no way you're going to be able to like grind. I think grinding is the only way you're going to get things in flour, right? But yeah, like as in, if there's a way to accomplish this end you are trying to get to, that doesn't involve being mevatel and iser,
right?
That would be ideal. But if there's no other way, go wild. Does someone have a hand?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, I think we saw it like during the Chazara, so I thought, could it mean like that let's say the food is too sweet and I want to add some more stuff in order to make it less sweet, like the kind of dvash?
So I think it's just because he's citing this other siman where they talk about this process of the clarifying of the honey and the ants, that I think that is what he's referring to.
Okay.
That it's like, yeah, I don't really know why the clarifying of the honey is seen as like necessary. But I don't know enough about honey making to really speak confidently there. In any case, that's a fun little chiddush, right? That he's saying like the bemazed is only when you're bemazed, when you're intentional.
You know what I think it might be with the honey? I think it might be if you heat it up, it becomes thinner and it's easier to pour through a sieve. It gets more liquidy. And the problem with heating it up, though, is that you're causing the flavor of the bugs to get into the honey. Even though maybe
it's not that you're causing the flavor, it's stuff that you're like dissolving the bugs, right? That's like it's the issue.
Or you might dissolve some of the bugs, right? You might dissolve some of the bugs, but your goal is probably to get out like the large bees and things that are in there.
Well, dafka, the idea would be that can't be your goal, right? Your goal has to be, I'm trying to make this.
No. It is your goal. You're heating it up to make the funny more fluid, less viscous, so that you could pour it through and get out the big stuff that's in there. And in the process of doing that, you might cause some small stuff to really dissolve and be impossible to get out. Right. Something like that. Or the top.
Right. In these scenarios, if your kavanah is not for the bitul, shkayach, the food is permitted even to you. So continue. ומה שכתב כאן,
עבר וביטלו או שריבה וכולי, לכאורה הוא כפל, דביטול היינו ריבה. ונראה דהרי כאמר עבר וביטל וזרק האיסור מועט לתוך היתר, מרובע שיש 60 נגדו. Did I skip a line or something?
No.
או שנפל מעצמו לאין 60 בהיתר, אלא שריבה אחר כך. So the difference between עבר וביטלו or ריבה is עבר וביטלו is the first description of the Shulchan Aruch, ein mevatlin isur lechatchila, is taking a little bit of the isur and putting it on purpose into enough heter that it is batel, versus like if some fell into not enough heter, then riba is you added more heter to batel it on purpose.
Correct. So both of those, he's like, it seems like that was extraneous phrasing, but actually And this also like works nicely, right, with the bit that we'll get into with the Durabanans, right, where those were kind of different levels of bitul, right? There, the first one is like Marivim Be'adayim, right, where you intentionally put the Istorin in the first place to batel it, and the second is like it fell in. Now I'm trying to add more to batel what has been made problematic. Okay, that's our first Taz. If you will see, there's a very long Taz on set. We're not going to read all of it because that would take a very long time. The first part, he has a nice little chiddush. We didn't spend a lot of time looking at the source. One of the sources the Beit Yosef cites about the like when you have dvarim chashuvim that can't be batel, and the idea of like if one falls into the sea, right, that then the rest of it's permitted. And there seemed to be this inconsistency between the scenario where we say, even if one fell and you did it like b'shogeg, not trying to do bitul of this mixture, that it's usser. But we talk about like nitzpatsu, right? If you smashed open like a nut that was in and of itself a devar chashuv that couldn't be batel accidentally, it is batel. Right, so we have this seeming inconsistency of when do we kansu shogeg atu mezid, right? When are we saying if you do something b'shogeg, we still are going to forbid it, lest you come to do it b'mezid? And the Taz says this actually isn't inconsistent at all, and he has this really smart explanation of the difference is that when I come before somebody with my like soup that had some like bacon bit fell into it and then some more soup got mixed in, and now I definitely have shishim times it. Unclear if when it first fell in there is shishim. The person I'm holding this before, the chacham, who I'm like, hey, this just happened, they see a kosher soup, right? What they're getting in front of them is something that is completely kosher, and they wouldn't have known there was any problem unless you told them about this bacon falling in and about the like sequence of events. Right? In these scenarios, you're bringing something before them that is visibly already bateled, and they wouldn't know there's even a problem if you didn't mention it, right? Whereas the case of like all the avodah zarah stuff, and one of them fell into the ocean, you're coming and trying to convince them. You're like, really, one of them fell accidentally, I promise, and wouldn't be clear to them that the mixture in front of them is a permitted one. So that makes sense. It's like I think it's a smart chiluk, right? Why we would say in that latter scenario where you're actually like we're relying on your testimony to matir this scenario, we like our kansu shogeg atu mezid. But in the previous ones where it's only your testimony that would even make us concerned about this in the first place, we're not kansu shogeg atu mezid. That's his first distinction. Now he's gonna weigh in on the whole Tor smog discussion as to what he thinks they're really dealing with. Aaron, could you read from Venirelli at the bottom of Kuf Aleph in the Taz? Or Kuf Aleph page, it's in Chet of the Taz.
Venirelli da Tor Lamad B'divrei Smog.
Wait. I don't have the place.
So the page is Kuf Aleph in the Shir.
Well, I have different pages than you, so
okay. So it's in Chet of the Tor. Venirelli da Tor Lamad B'divrei Hasmag.
About approximately how far into the Taz is that?
It's maybe a third, half the way through Chet.
Venirelli de Tour. Okay, gotcha.
Take it away.
Nearly da Tor Lama B'divrei Smog, Devare lo chai Hashem anitra be'achar shenafal Yisro sham, v'nishtaha k'tzat. Kim ken haya chaticha atzma na'aseh nevela, be'basar b'chalav. V'lo mahane achar kach tosefet mayim, elim ken yesh sham shishim neged atav shel kulo, v'gam neged ketera. V'zeh ei efshar. Translator, keep going.
Translate that, yeah.
The Torah understood the smog as saying that we're not worried that about a case in which something was added to the forbidden mixture with there being in a case in which there had been a waiting period, because in such a case it would obviously be a case of Hanan. So we must be talking about a case in which the thing was added in immediately afterwards.
Right, that like this like riba, this ribui must have occurred like almost instantaneously after the Isser initially fell in.
I'm sorry, can you wait, Lexie, can you give a little context to what we're talking about here? I don't quite follow what the discussion is.
Yes, right. So remember that like the smog was talking about the chakira v'chacham, right? In the case where like Isser fell in and then more heter was added, and about that being necessary. And the Torah was like, there's no need to do the chakira. Like if their shoge gets permitted and if they're mazid, why would we trust them not to lie to us? And we saw these different explanations, right, as to what are they disagreeing about. And a big concern that we see coming up throughout is the issue of Hanan, right? That like one of the suggestions was, oh, the smog is just more worried about Hanan, that like there wouldn't have been 60 when it first fell in, and then all of that became usher, and you need 60 times the initial mixture.
Because the smog holds
Hanan
Hanan in Shari Surim, unlike the Tur.
Correct. But then the challenge that was posed as to that explanation is like the Torah still holds Hanan in Basar B'chalav, right? So like if that was really a distinction being made, it seems like he would have made it.
Needed to specify that this is only in Shari Surim.
Precisely. And also that basically we're saying what the Taz is pointing out is that that doesn't seem to be how the Torah is understanding the smog, right? Because if the smog really thinks that like we're worried about Hanan happening here, there would basically be no situation in which it would be permitted, right? Because if we had to measure against whatever it initially fell into, including the Kedera, right? The possibility of whatever fell in afterwards being Shishim times that initial mixture is basically none, right? So he's saying the Torah didn't think the smog was talking about scenarios where the Isser fell in and it waited long enough that that first mixture could become Hanan and then more came.
But I mean, why couldn't it have been a large pot with a very small amount of Isser? You're saying because of the rule that a pot never holds more than 60 times.
Well, no, because also, I mean, part of what he brings in. So I'm going to read a brief line, and then Aaron will resume. If we look back in it, Beit Yosef katuv im haya ba'otan hamayim shishim neged kol mash b'gdera modas smag shari im natna shogeg. Right, like the Beit Yosef says, oh yeah, the smog would agree if there's 60 times what was in it, he would agree it's permitted. V'hu tamur ma'od tehagam neged hagdera atzma ba'inan shishim mishum zeh lamad. Right, like he's like the Taz doesn't think that would really occur, because he's saying if you have to measure against the pot too, the likelihood of having, even if the amount of Isser within the pot was small, the likelihood of you having Shishim times whatever that was mixed with and the pot is slim.
Well, this is a Kedera Hadasha, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Unless it's or even Ben Yomo. I mean, Eno Ben Yomo.
Taz is not convinced by that. He thinks the likelihood of you actually being able to do a successful ribui if Hanan occurred is basically none. So he's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. So Aaron, can you pick up with Mishum Zeh?
Mishum Zeh Lamadator B'dah Smog.
Can I interrupt for 1 second? I just want to make sure this is clear to me. Right? The objection here is because the Torah objects to the smog based on the fact that the fact that if we ask them this, they could just lie about it, essentially the same, right? In the same way they could lie about any other number of things. And he doesn't bring up the Hanan issue to the smog. That's why we think that the Torah doesn't think the smog is concerned with Hanan here.
Right. Both that the language of their disagreement doesn't seem to really be focusing on Hanan at all, and because the Taz thinks that must not be what either of them is speaking about, because otherwise, if we're really being worried about Hanan in the scenario, there's almost no scenario in which it would be permitted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mishum Zeh Lamadator B'dah Smog Del Zavade Lo Chashinan Del Lo Mechazkenan Riuta B'Shum Duchta Lomar Shaya B'derech Shia Asur. So the Torah learns regarding the smog that we're definitely not worried about Hanan, because we don't translate idiomatically. We don't assume facts that we don't need to assume for the worst.
For the worst, right?
But we don't assume that like Hanan occurred, essentially.
Because we don't assume that there were stages. in the creation of this concoction that came before us, when we have no reason to assume there's stages. That's the idea. We don't create troubles where there's none apparent.
Right. If we don't know what the timing was, we assume that it was pretty instantaneous. So now pick up with Ella al Korcha.
And this is maybe Pshita, but this is the exact opposite of what the Derech Moshe thinks is happening, where we have a defined no daben time period or lo no. Ella al Korcha, the Kanyesh Chashash, Binyan Sheyesh Takana Levatel Ha'Yisur Ayde Haribui. Bezechashtenan Le Shibamezi Dasa Tikun. We must be talking about a case in which it would be theoretically possible to do bitul through ribui, and what we're worried about is that he did it b'mezid.
Okay, keep going.
נמצא שכאן הווה החשש שמא תקף שנפל האיסור ריבה שם מים קודם שנתפשט האיסור. So what we're worried about is just as soon as it fell in, he immediately put water in before the Isser spread out and before there was time for Chanan to occur, whether you hold it for Shari Surim or not.
Okay.
Ukinyan Shamrinan, Siman Saribet, Bedin Tipa Chalav, Linyan Nuar Kadera, Noar Kadera.
Right.
Similar to what we say in Saribet about before you stir the pot. Volcano Mars. Hasmag shetzarich lechor achar ze im naaseh sham ribui.
Sorry. He made his main point, right? And now he's going to say, yeah, actually what they're disagreeing about is what it sounds like they're disagreeing about, right? I think like last week Sarah was like, I don't like that they're not taking the Torah at his word, right? They're not really reading what he seems to be saying. And I think the kind of benefit of the Taz's read is he is taking the Torah at his word. Right? He's essentially saying, no, we're not dealing with a case where Chanan would be an issue. We're assuming that Chanan did not occur here. And the Smog is worried that people will have b'mezid added more water or whatever it is immediately to Batel the Isser. And that's why we need this Chakira to determine whether this was done b'mezid or b'shogeg.
In other words, we're interested in this Kanas, in the Kanas of our Seif. We have this Kanas in our Seif, and we're worried, do we have to apply this Kanas or not? That's the Hakira.
Precisely. And that's why the Torah's pushback is, that makes no sense, because like if they're Shogeg, it's fine, and if they're Mazid, how would this Hakira help us? Like, why would we trust them not to lie to us? Right? That's the Torah. And so this is like, yeah, that's what they're disagreeing about. So he essentially like pushes aside the issue of Chanan. He's like, that's not what the dispute is on. Because if Chanan is an issue, then everyone's worried about it. Okay.
Well, this gets into the question of whether of shofech b'meiz. In other words, what if they did it intentionally, but they didn't know it was forbidden to do that? Is that called shogeg?
Well,
because
so glad you brought that up. Rav Nachum, do you want to read Tet in the Taz?
Wait, we're finished with Chet?
I mean, again, the rest of Chet, I summarized where he goes with the rest of it.
Okay. But in other words, I just want to connect it, because if they poured it in, if we think that pouring it in, if that's called the mazid, if they did it because they didn't know, then that would be a hakira that we could perform, because we could ask them, did you pour it in? And they would admit it.
Right now, you're just saying the words of the Taz, so you should just read the Taz.
Okay. Im b'mezid l'chora nira melashon atur shekatav kan im lo kiven levatel ha'isser v'chul. If he didn't intend to mevatel the isser, v'ken achar kach shekatav aval hamikaven l'rabot, but who intends to. So he seems to be distinguishing between intent to mevatel and not intent. It just has to do with your intention. Were you trying to mevatel or not? Even though the reason that he was trying to do it was because he thought it was mutter to do that. He ta'abadin. He made a mistake in his knowledge of the halacha. V'savar shemuter laharbot levatel ha'isser mikol makom mikre mezid. But I'm just pointing out this is a contradiction to the previous Taz, because in the previous Taz he just. Oh, the Taz is going to address this.
Yes, he's saying
okay.
But He's saying the language here
Yes.
of the
Makom,
language
mikra b'mezid.
in implies that if you were intending to do bitul, but you just thought it was permitted to do that, that would still be mezid. But now he says, if you like chen mashma ube'emet.
Wait. Kevan shenitkaven b'mezid levatel ha'isur v'ken mashma medivrei rashal. Where do you want me to read?
So from ube'emet lo nireh kach.
See, it's easy for you to skip here.
It's just the next.
It's right there, right after what you were reading, like after the reference.
Ube'emet lo nireh kach. De'im ken kasha al hatur shekatav kan she'im banu lachshosh lezeh gam lo namin lo ma she'amar shelo riba b'chulei ve'im ita. In other words, ve'im ita shemi sheto'eh badin mikre mezid kevan shemarbe b'kavana. If that's called mezid, and therefore we would have put a kanas on it, levat kevan shemarbe b'kavana levatela iser tikshe lecha my makshe atur ala smag akati nema shetzarich lachor imasa b'mezid shekiven laharbot ala iser levatlo v'tabadim. In other words, then you would have a reason to do this hakira according to the tour, even according to the tour, because you would just want to find out. He's a totally honest fellow, or lower lady, and he admits that he poured it in because he thought it was mutter to do it. And he say, you did it intentional. That's called intentional. Sorry, Charlie. And then with the hakira would be relevant. V'savar shehu mutar ubezeh lo yishakir v'yomar emet. He'll tell you the truth because he's just the person who made a mistake and didn't. Ki ein alav chashad she'asa avera ela ta'ut v'amai lo nidrashnu im ta'a im lav ela al karchacha shegam ze mikri shogeg. No, okay. That's also called shogeg. You have to say, and it was based on his previous learning of defining the machlokas as he did about whether the kanas should be applied or whether the kanas shouldn't be applied. He's got to say that it's called shogeg, and it would be mutter anyway. So the hakira wouldn't help us. We would have mattered it anyway. So the hakira didn't help us.
Right, because again, if we say according to the Torah, if you were intending to batel something, but you were to'eh b'din and you just thought that was permitted, like it would make perfect sense to do a hakira, right? Like again, as you said, that person doesn't think they did anything wrong. They're not like a Russia. They're just someone who like had a mistaken assumption. So they would absolutely tell you the truth, right? So it must be that the Torah thinks to'eh b'din is considered shogeg, right? And so if you look at like a couple lines from the bottom of Tet, where he says Mishum Hachi Nireli, he says Mishum Hachi Nireli Demashikatavator Aval Himikaven Leherbot Pirusho Shiyodea Shigish Isor Bedavar Vafil Hachi Osehu, right? Zem Mikre Mezid, right? He's like, we must read when he says Mikaven Leherbot, he means intends
Mikaven La'asot Avera,
knowing that it's Aser. Precisely, which is not necessarily the most straightforward read of Mikaven Neharbot, but he's like, otherwise the Torah has a big kashi on himself, so that's how we're gonna have to.
Unless we read the Torah differently entirely, like the Darkei Moshe read it.
Well, I don't think that actually as in like even the ways the Darkei Moshe read it, right? It's still the Torah just straight up has the language, right, of the whole concern that if we're worried about Mazid, the Chakirah doesn't make any difference because they would lie to us. That's in the Torah, regardless of how else you explain. Like the Darkei Moshe found various other ways to explain the Ikar of their dispute, but those words are in the Torah. Like he said, the Chakirah wouldn't make sense if we're trying to figure out if they're Mazid because they would just lie to us, right? And so if he thinks that Kavanah, that like To'eh B'din is considered Mazid, he would, I think it's hard to avoid him having had a kashi on himself if he believed that. So this is why the Taz is Bidol Chekra, resolving his language, is actually referring to proper mazid of even when you are not Toa Badin, you know it's Asar, you're doing it anyway. Okay. Let's look. I want to glance. So if we just to recenter ourselves in the Shulchan Aruch itself, we have the little insertion from the Ramah, right, when we're talking about the Knas. When we said that not only is it usher for the person who mevatel it or somebody they mevatel it for, but that he said even to sell it to another Jew is forbidden, because you shouldn't benefit from the bitul. So if you look at the Shach Yud Bet from Veli Nired to Dafka, Jacob, can you read in the Shach?
Yeah. Hold on, I'm just getting to it in the Shach.
It's right in the middle. It's about halfway through the Shach.
Okay. Right. Sorry, that just thrown off and I think
We're in Yud Bet, halfway through in the Shach. Velini read Dafka.
Oh, yeah. Velini read Dafka Kisha Yisrael Lokeach Bioker Meha of De Kochabim Asor Dilav Hachi in Tam Asro and Korle Israel. The Halo Ahani Nasav Haraim Kach Kinyerly.
Okay.
So, and it appears to me that specifically when Israel takes like a value, like at a high price,
A higher price, right?
something usher from Ovdei Kochavim.
No, so biyoker ma'oved kochabim, right? That
Oh,
if
it's a higher price than that of Ovdei Kochavim, that it would be forbidden. If not, there wouldn't be any reason to forbid selling it to Yisrael, since he wouldn't be doing anything wrong.
right, he wouldn't be benefiting from
Right.
Right? That like if this Yisrael is like, wow, I really love the concept that I'm gonna be drinking some butternut bacon soup. Then sorry, I it's a random example, but like I don't have a lot of good examples in my house. If they're like, I love the chiddush of that, so I will pay you twice as much as I usually would for the soup. That would be forbidden. But like if they'll just pay you the same amount that they would for that soup if it didn't have a dissolved bacon bit in it, then like you didn't benefit from your bitul, right? It's just it's soup, right? So he's like, this Mocher Yisrael should only really be if it would be more expensive. Aaron?
Alan and I were talking about this, about what constitutes benefiting here. It seems you do still, even if you're not benefiting insofar as you're selling it above market price, you're still benefiting by getting to recoup the loss of the money you spent on the thing that has now been ruined.
But you do that if you sell it to a non-Jew too.
I mean, like not really, because you could have sold it. We're assuming you could have sold it to a Novid Kochabim if you didn't bottle it. So, yeah.
Right. It had a value even before you bottled it, even though it was treif, you could have sold it to a Gentile. So you could sell it to a Jew at the price that you would have been able to sell it had you not done the bitul.
Right.
Right.
The only thing is you can't sell it for more than you would have been if it had remained treif. Okay.
I mean, do you mind if I jump in? This works with his claim of like, there's really no Isur Hana'ah. This is on this thing, right? What the Isur is the benefit of having been mevatel it, and the benefit of being mevatel is you can get a Jew to pay more than you would to get a non-Jew to pay for it. I think this is,
right. And you kind of have to say that because the Ramah says, Asur limkor leYisrael acher, and so why didn't he just say Asur limkor to anybody?
Also because it's like shelo yehanu mima shebatlu, right? That he shouldn't benefit from having buttled, right? It's not that this whole thing is a sort of, it's just that you shouldn't be able to get any benefit from specifically having been mevatel iser. So that's the only way in which you would be batelling from the bitul of the iser is if you or some other Jew eats it, or if you sell it for a higher price than you could if it were treif. Okay, now we're jumping back into the Ramah and the Sif. Andres, can you read the Haggah?
Does it mean if you
like higher
if
price than if it were kosher, right?
What?
No, as in like a higher price than a non-Jew would pay for treif / a higher price than if this were just kosher and never had bitul.
Okay.
This should mean that if it were basar b'chalav, because you are subhanallah of the tarovet, like then there's a question if you have batel purpose.
I mean, with that, we would just have to assume that it's no longer basar b'chalav, right? We're dealing with something that has been batel, right? Like when something is basar and chalav, it's asar b'hana. But here we're dealing with food that has been successfully batel.
Right. But the way you framed it as being an advantage, as being your profit over what you could have sold it for if you hadn't bateled it, then maybe in that case you can't sell it to a non-Jew either, which they don't specify.
That actually works really well with the Taz's explanation, right? That these areas of the cases of ribui we're dealing with are pretty much never going to be when Hanan already happened, right? That he's saying ribui is happening before Hanan is able to take place. So according to that reading, basar, it would never become actually proper basar b'chalav. So that would work well for him. Okay, so Andres, we're in the Tzaditet in Seif Hey, the Haggah. So the Shulchan Aruch just said L'shar kol adam mutar. Now we have Haggah v'dafka shenitarev.
I'm opening very well. ודווקא שנתערב יבש ביבש, או אפילו לך בלך, למען דאמר שאין אומרים בו חתיכה נעשית נבלה, כדאיל סימן צדיק ב', אבל חתיכה שבלעה איסור, לא מהנה שנתוסף אחר כך ההיתר דאמרינן בי חתיכה נעשה נבלה. ויש אומרים דאפילו במקום דלא אמרינן חתיכה נעשית נבלה, לא מהנה ההיתר לבטל, אלא נתוסף קודם שנודע תערובת. Just give me a second, I have to change. Sorry. אבל אם נודע תערובת קודם, לא מהנה מה שנתוסף אחר כך. ולפי זה היה צריך חכם המורה לבטל איסור לחקור אם נתוסף ההיתר לאחר שנודע, ולא נהגו כן. וואו.
So you don't need to translate word for word. What is his first point about Hanan?
So he
This is following up on the statement of mutar, right? That like is following up on the statement that like if you are mevatalet, even b'mezid, the food itself is mutar. Certainly like l'shar kol adam, right? But it's mutar dafka.
יבש ביבש או לך בלך, אפילו לך בלך. Yeah.
Right, or lach balach for the, according to those who, right, on lach balach, everyone agrees the avesh biavesh chanan doesn't apply. Lach balach, there's a dispute, but some say it also doesn't apply, right? So in those scenarios, great, Isser has been detailed.
But if the chaticha swallowed before the isur, yeah, and then you add the heiter, then we say that there is not a chanan again. And even if you don't say that there is chanan, it doesn't work if you add the heiter afterwards.
Well, right. So first of all, we say in the case of like chaticha, right? Everyone would say chanan happens there if it absorbs it. And then shendosef acher kach, it doesn't matter if you add more afterwards. Like that piece is never going to become permitted again. And if you don't have 60 times that whole piece, also everything will stay forbidden, right? And then the yeshomrim is he's like, okay, first of all, I made my point that this whole ribui thing has to be dealing with a scenario where chanan didn't occur, right? And some say, what's the yeshomrim?
That even if you don't say that there is chanan, it it doesn't work if you add the heter in order to nullify it, but only in the case where you added before you knew it, before you were aware of the mixing. The whole Noda thing.
Right. That like he's saying that some people, like there's an opinion that even in a scenario that you wouldn't believe Chanan occurs in, right? So for example, those who don't hold Chanan Bashari Sorim, so anything with Basar B'chalav, or those who do hold it Bashari Sorim, but like, you know.
But not in Yavish, B'Yavish.
That maybe they would only say the bittul works if you weren't aware of the initial mixture before the ribui occurred. But if you became aware of the initial mixture before more was added, even if the rest was added b'shogeg, maybe they would say it's usher, right? That's the yeshomrim, right?
There's
So then
there's a bit of a chiddush here that I didn't notice before, which is that he's saying that this whole noda doesn't help when it's a chaticha that absorbed a drop.
well, no, he's saying not only does noda not help, noda dafka harms, right?
No, I'm saying the lack of noda doesn't help. You might have thought that the lack of noda helped in all cases, but he's saying no, the lack of noda only helps in the cases where we wouldn't have said chanan anyway. And it's only a chumrah.
I found this very confusing because in the Darchei Moshe, it looked like he was saying this about Davka, the case of Chanan.
Yeah, I know, but look, if you leave the lesson here.
The way that the Shach understands him is this Yeshomrim actually is kind of a separate thing that the Ramah, would believe im lo noda, that it does work even with, like, that Chanan doesn't occur even with Balua, right?
That's not what it said. But I agree with me, that's not the way that sounds.
No, but this is the Yeshomrim is about im noda, right? He's saying this Yeshomrim is coming to add.
Yeah, but it's only on b'makom shelo amrin haticha nase nevela, to the exclusion of a piece that absorbed Isser.
Correct.
Where this whole thing doesn't apply.
I wanna articulate how this works. Where also the Shach has a lot of kushias on the Ramah. So the Shach explains that what's happening here is in the Ramah believes that in Chanan, and also this is going off the Isser v'Heter Haruch. This isn't his Chiddush. This is actually him quoting the Isser v'Heter Haruch, right? That according to the Noda B'Intayim paradigm that the Isser Haruch sets up, it is a 1-1, whether you believe Chanan, whether it's a scenario where Chanan can occur or not. That if it's a scenario where Chanan can occur, im lo noda b'intayim, Chanan doesn't occur if you weren't aware of the mixture before more was added. And im noda, then it's aser, right? And this is part of why the Shach has some major critiques of the noda b'intayim paradigm. So first of all, I want us to just point, I think we're not going to read much inside of the Yodalid, but in Yodalid in the Shach, he points out an issue that one of the Darchei Moshe's arguments, right, was about, oh, maybe we're just dealing with like lach belach, and so and Chanan wouldn't occur. And he points out that the issue with this is Chanan clearly does apply to lach belach with basar v'chalav, right? That even for those who believe that Chanan doesn't occur with most Isurim in lach belach, it's very clear from our Gemara that Chanan can occur with basar v'chalav in that scenario, right? He mentions the example of like the little piece of meat that falls into the boiling milk vat, right? And it raises the issue of if the milk absorbed in that meat was re-expelled into the rest of the boiling milk, that it like the milk that had been absorbed was naset nevela, right? And that's a case of like liquidy stuff. And he's saying we see that like even with basar v'chalav, lach balach does become chanan. And so he doesn't like that answer that Darchei Moshe, right? So if we go back to like the 3 different answers that Darchei Moshe suggested, he says limiting the case that the Torah and the Smag are talking about to lach balach, that doesn't make sense, right? Because actually, according to the Torah, who agrees basar v'chalav can be chanan, that would still be an issue with lach balach. Second, tet vav is going to get at what Rav Nachum was talking about, right? So this is about the issue of noda b'intayim. So let's who Alan, you haven't read yet. Look in tet vav. Look at lefi zeh mashkatav. It's like maybe 6 lines down in it.
Yeah, see, Tet Zion, Tefa. V'yesh omrim the fila.
So a few lines down in
6
that.
lines down.
Iza mash katav kan bahaga.
See, Ad Kama Shano. Oh, the Fizeh, got it. Okay. The Fizeh mash katav kan katuv kan behaga. The fila b'makam de la amrin and Fatitha Nesin Bela. Kole. Hachi Kamar. Lot Mabaye b'makom de amrin and Fatitha Nesin Bela. Diyesh chiluk ben nada ola. Ella afilo b'makom de la amrin Fatitha Nesin Bela. La tema de afilo nada shari. Kol shri babashogeg. Ella kol shnada aser. Okay. Should I stop? Keep going.
Translate that, because that is essentially the Shach reading this Ramah differently
Right.
than we're articulating.
Okay, so what the Haggah said, that even in a situation where we don't say Hanan, what he was really saying was, okay, we don't even, it goes without saying that in a place where Hanan would apply, there's a distinction between whether the knowledge has kicked in or not. But even in a place where we don't say Hanan, we wouldn't say that if a person had become conscious of the Isser falling in, that it's okay, as long as the water was poured into Shogeg. No, anyone that as soon as you become aware, even in a non-Siman case, the entire mixture becomes Isser.
Right. So he's reading it as like, yes, when there's Hanan, there is the chiluk of like lo nodab in time, it works. Nodab in time, it doesn't work. But he's adding that even in a case where there isn't Hanan, that chiluk applies, right? So that's what he's seeing the Isser B'Heter Ha'aruch and the Ramah is saying. And he's reading it this way. To be clear, I can see why it would be confusing from the language in this Ramah, but based off of, as you pointed out, the phrasing in the Darchei Moshe and the phrasing in the Isser B'Heter Ha'aruch, he's like, that seems to be what they're saying, and they're more spelled out formulations of this, right? But now the Shach is going to challenge that understanding. So the next bit is just v'hachi ita da, and then he says Mikol makom divrei ha'isur v'hater aruch.
Right. V'hachi ita Mikol makom divrei ha'isur v'hater aruch. Berav tzurich ian. Dekevan dekaimelan Hanan. Imken miad shenitaved naset nevela. ומה בזה שלא נדע? מכל מקום מיד נחשב כחתיכה נבלה. ולא מצינו בשום פוסק לחלק בין נדלה. Right, so it's a good kasha. So there is a problem with the Zervat Haruch and Mechaber, because since we hold Hanan, immediately once the piece gets mixed up, the whole mixture becomes nevela, and so what does it matter whether he knows or not? The whole thing is considered like a chaticha nevela, and we don't find anyone who says that there's a distinction between not knowing or not.
He's like, yeah, no, he's like, this also gets back to a question that we were discussing last week about the extent to which Hanan is physical and the extent to which it's mental, right? And he's like, there is clearly a physical aspect to it, right? And so like to say it's purely a nodeb on time thing, like, no, it's very clear from our sources that like there are scenarios where like just the physical thing is not set nevela, right? And it doesn't matter whether you became aware of that, like that's what we describe as happening. And he marshals a whole array of sources from our Gemaras that make it very clear that this is what's occurring. He also makes a really good point, right? Which is that some of the sources that the people who don't hold Hanan b'Shari Sorim use to prove that Hanan doesn't apply in Shari Sorim, if this nodab in time thing were true, they could have just said, oh, well, that's a case where lo nodab, right? Hanan didn't apply there, not because like Hanan only can occur with Basar B'Chalav, but just because that was a scenario of lo nodab, right? But otherwise it could apply to novela or whatnot, right? He's like, if that were true, this could be applied so broadly, and it's not. He's like, we don't see anybody else using this distinction. So he first of all is challenging the notion that like lo noda would prevent something from becoming chanan, right? And then he pushes back against the chumrah, right? The chumrah of the Yesh Omrim is that even for things where we don't say chanan, if im noda ben time, the ribui doesn't work. So I apologize for the skipping, but as you see, there's very large nosei kelim, so I want us to get important chunks out of them. If in this massive shach, if you're in the Sheret Devorah, it's on the left side, the left column of it. Gam mashikatav ha'isar v'heter ha'aruch. It's 3 lines down from the top. This is like vitzarich is the first part. I don't know for people who are not in that thing exactly how to helpfully cite this, other than that it's about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through this huge shach. But we say v'tzarich gam mashikatav ha'isar v'heter ha'aruch sham.
Great, I've got it. Should I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. אפילו במקום דלא אמרינן חתיכה נעשה נבלה, אם נודע אסור אף בשוגג. ומפרש, מה שכתב הטור, וזהו שנו. כתוב בספר מצווה שצריך החכם לחקור אם נתנו מים בקדרה אחר שניתנו האיסור, שאותם המים אם מצטרפים לבטל האיסור. Okay, so just briefly, what the Heter said, that even in a situation where we don't say chanan, if the consciousness kicks in, then even b'shogeg, the whole thing is aser, and that it explains what the Torah said earlier, what the Torah says elsewhere.
Not that it explains, but like they explain.
It explains that which the Torah says. It says in the Sefer Mitzvah that the Chacham needs to check whether water was poured in after the Isser, because the water would not get combined to Mevatel Isser. V'nereli de'ena tzarich shefilu hosif mayim achar kach hakaimelan kol ha'isurim sheriba alehem b'shogeg mutarim. ואין לחוש שמכיוון להרבות במזיד. שאם באנו לחוש לזה, גם לא נאמין לו מה שאמר שלא ריבה. עד כאן לשנה. Right. This is all the tour, right? Seems we don't have to do the inspection, even if you add water afterwards. We hold if the water is added b'shogeg, everything's mutar. And we don't worry that the person intended to add it b'mezid, because then why would we believe him when we were doing the inspection of asking whether or not he added it? So that's the Torah. Dehainu b'lo noda ben time ava b'noda gam haTorah modedasa. All of that which the Torah just said is referring to a case where consciousness is not, they haven't become conscious that the Isra was dropped in. But if they do, then even the Torah would agree that the mixture is not okay.
Right. So like, read the next 2 words.
Lanihar doesn't make sense.
Like that just does not appear to be the reading of the Torah, right? He's like the idea of, oh, this is only referring to a case of lo noda ben time, but any scenario where it was noda ben time, actually, everything would be aser. I would agree with the smag. It's like that's just very much not the pshat of what he's saying here. And he points out also, like he explains that Darchei Moshe, if you recall, tried like B'dochek to resolve this and say, oh, well, the Torah actually is just considering noda ben time as being mazid, because really you should have taken it off the fire if it like im noda, right? So it's basically like mazid if you kept it there and then more fell in. But again, that's like B'dochek, right? That's a difficult way to explain the Torah. So the Shach ends up basically brushing aside this entire chiluk of noda or ein noda. He says this just doesn't track in any of our sources. It's really just the Isser v'Heter Aruch and the Ramah that seem to think this makes sense. And if you look at the very last line of this one, right before Tet Zayin, he just says, "Az barai de'en lechalek b'zeh klal ben noda ulo." Ella ben b'shogeg umezid ukudamashma b'divrei b'chol poskim. He's like, noda lo noda is just not a distinction we're making. It's about mezid and shogeg. That's what we deal with, right? So he dismisses various aspects of this Ramah he thinks make no sense. And then he does do a little, I guess this isn't really defending the Ramah so much as the practice. Remember, if you recall, the last 3 words of this Haggah were, we really should be doing Chakira, Velona Hagukin, right? But we don't. And he's like, well, the answer is that this kind of echoes what the Taz said, but that if you don't know, right, that like something had less than the amount of Bitul before Mar was added, right? Like we don't put something bechezkat isur, right? So unless we know bivadai that there was less than a shear of Bitul when something first fell in, and that like either things were added afterwards b'mezid, or the initial amount was made chanan, we don't assume that, right? So that's why we don't need to do this chakira in general. Okay. Vav, we're gonna go real quick through the next 2. Who has not read? Ilana, do you want to read? Are you going to read Vav in the Shulchan Aruch in Saritet?
Sure. Isur shel divreihem ein ma'arvin oto bayadayim kedei levatlo, ve'im asa ken b'mezid asur, aval im nafal me'atzmo ve'ein beheter kedei levatlo, marbe alav umevatlo. Okay, so we're talking about Isurei Derabanan. You can't, I guess it's like levatel milechatchila, as we said with Isurei Doraita. This idea of Maravin Bayadayim seems to be a way of saying like actively doing bitul. But if you do it, if you do it b'diavad, if it's done, then if you did it b'mezid, it's asur. But if the bitul happened of its own accord, okay, but it was insufficient bitul, like we saw in the Beitza Sugya with the Eitzim Sheneshru Me'adekel, like it starts to happen of its own. But it wasn't sufficient, then one is allowed to add to the bitul process that has already begun until there is a sufficient shiur levatel isur.
Right. I'm not allowed to like pour a drop of milk into my chicken soup knowing that there's 60 times that milk, but if my milk falls into 40 times its amount of chicken soup, I can add more chicken soup to batel it. Right, so now the Ramah comes in with the Rosh's opinion that disagrees. V'yesh
omrim de'ein levatel isur derabanan o lahosif alav kemo be'isur deoraita v'chein nohagin ve'ein leshanot. So this is a more machmir opinion that just like with as with deoraita isurim, you can't levatel an isur derabanan, nor can you be mosif, unlike what the Mechaber said. And he says this is how we practice, and this is what one should do.
Okay.
Should I go on?
Yeah.
Okay. Isur shenitbatel kigon shehaya shishim kenegdo v'nitvasef bo achar kach min ha'isur harishon chozer v'nior v'ne'asar lashna min b'mino lashna min b'she'eno mino lashna yavesh lashna lach lashna noda b'intayim or lo noda b'intayim. Okay, wait, I'll stop there for a minute. If you have an isur, okay, that became bateld already, okay, so you had a kazayit of isur and there's shishim kenegdo, but then more isur of the same type goes in, so now you have like another zayit of isur. That can go and reawaken the original Isur, because now you have 2 Zaytim and 60 Heter, which is not a good, now we no longer have a shore of Bitul. So it's not like it's not like what we saw in the Kama Batil Sugya and Avodah Zarah, where we said once something is battled, it's done, and the whole thing is considered Heter. No, that's not what he's saying.
Dafka, no, Kama Batel, right. There was like, it never happens. Kama Batel is not a thing. Closer of an Aor, no matter what, in any circumstance.
Right. It can always, an Isur can always come back to life.
Right. Which there's like, we're not going to read it inside, but there's like one more snappy shot on this where he points out that like, really, you should say kama kama batel if nowhere else with yavesh v'yavesh mim b'mino, because there it's like, it's yavesh v'yavesh, right? So it's batel barov, even durabanan, and it's mim b'mino, where like even if it was cooked, you wouldn't be able to taste the flavor of Isser, and it's not cooked. And so he's like, in that scenario, you really should say kama kama batel with yavesh biyavesh mim b'mino. He ends up being like, everyone else, all the other Ashkenazi poskim disagree with me, so you should only rely on my opinion, like b'shata dachak. But really, in that scenario, kama kama batel should apply.
You mean even if there's like 1 to 2, and then another one falls in, and then another one falls in? So you have majority, even if you have majority of Isur.
Yeah. Because the Isser has been batel. It's not significant vis-a-vis the other things. It doesn't taste any different. It doesn't look any different. There's no scenario in which you would be able to taste it meaningfully, right? Like one of the big kashias that was raised against the Ravad, who was really all in on the kama kama batel, was like, how could you possibly say that, like, again, like you can keep having Isser dripping in and being batel when you would just be able to taste it after a while? And like we just seem to be very emphatic about the fact that like a core concept of kashrut is if you're tasting Isser, it is not batel, right?
But why not in min b'mino where liquids also?
Well, that's why we end up saying, because the idea is like zera atu min b'she'eno mino in liquids, right? That like with things where there's one step between where it's currently at and a scenario where you actually, the tam would be near gash, we say gzera, right? That even if in this case you can't taste the Isser, if like, oh, if this were min b'she'eno mino, you could taste it, or if you cooked this, you could taste it, then we say it's usser there too, like less, because it's like a step away from that, right? But what the Shach points out is that yavesh biyavesh mim b'mino is multiple steps away from any scenario in which the Isser would be like tasteable. Okay. Last chunk of this Haggah. Elena, can you pick up with the kazayit chalav?
Okay. כזית חלב שנפל למים ונתבטל בשישים, ואחר כך נפל מן המים לקדירה של בשר, מותר, אף על פי שאין בבשר שישים נגד החלב, שהרי נתבטל במים, וכל כיוצא בזה. So, okay, so you have milk falls into water, which is an interesting idea because like there's nothing asur here, right? The milk goes into the water and the milk is batiled by the amount of water. But then that whole water mixture with its tiny bit of milk falls into a pot of meat. Okay, it's considered mutar, even though you do not have shishim of basar neged, that little bit of chalav that went in, because we consider it as if like it's a two-step process. Like first, the bitul happened on that chalav. That chalav no longer exists anymore. It's now basically a water mixture with negligible chalav. And all that went into the pot, and we kind of forget about the chalav by the by the time it goes into the meat.
Out, like, the chiddush here is actually, because this is all heter, it's certainly true, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, right? That like if that chalav fell into less than shishim of mayim, we don't say that the mayim is like naset chalav and suddenly you have like 50 parts milk, right? But they're saying not only that chanan doesn't apply with heter, but bitul can. Essentially, he's saying that like the milk can be made irrelevant vis-a-vis a ton of water, such that like, yeah, when that's being poured into or falls into the meat pot, like it's water, right? We don't see that initial milk as remaining distinct because no, it got dispersed throughout the water. We're worried about tam, and here there wouldn't be one, because even if the milk by itself had fallen into the meat, there'd be a problem. Now it has been diffused and it's no longer tasteable.
And why is it a chiddush? Why is that a chiddush?
Because since we like don't apply these ideas of, for example, chanan to heter, you might have thought that we don't really apply the idea of bitul to heter either, right? So I might have thought, okay, like that you can't be mavatel chalav and water. Like those are just two heter things. So I should just see those as two entities that fell onto my basar, and that includes like milk falling as its own kind of thing onto this basar that's not shishim connected, right? We're saying no. We think that like the idea of bitul is something being made irrelevant does apply even in cases of heter and heter. Okay, I'm gonna read this last saif so we can have time with Rav Nachman and Birya. So we have Zayin. Im nivla isor mu'at letoch kli kasher im darko shel oto kli lishtamesh bo b'shefa heter mutar lishtamesh bo lichatchila kevan she'isor mu'at v'efshar lebo lidei netinat tam. ולפיכך איסור משהו שנבלע בקדרה ובתוך חנקנים וכיוצא בהם מותר להשתמש בו לכתחילה ואפילו בבן יומו לפי שאי אפשר לבוא לידי נתינתם. Right? If a kli absorbs a very small amount of iser, if it's the type of kli that whenever I use it, I cook a large amount in it, I put a large amount of whatever heter edible thing I use, I can lichatchila continue to use that kli because the iser it absorbed is so minuscule that it is impossible I would ever be using an amount of heter in this kli such that there would be netinat tam, right? It's just heter, that iser is never going to be nikar. So things like big pots, right? If it absorbed like, yay much iser, I can just continue to use that pot, is what he's saying, even if it's ben yomo, right? Aval, im nivla b'kli shedarko lishtamesh le'etim b'davar mu'at kika'ara v'kayotze ba asor lishtamesh afilu b'shefa gzera shamishtamesh ba b'davar mu'at v'yavo lidei netinat tam. But if it's a kli that I often will use with a smaller amount of heter, like a bowl, then if it absorbed this tiny bit of iser, I can't lechatchila just continue using that for heter. Because even if right now I'm actually putting a massive amount of food in this bowl, so sometimes I just put like a little bit in it, we're worried that I'll end up using it when I'm only eating a little bit of heter in this bowl or in this little bottle. And in that scenario, there would be netinat tam. So with like smaller kalim, even if they only absorbed a tiny bit of iser, I cannot lechatchila use them. But with big kalim that I only ever use with mass quantities of food or drink, if they absorbed a tiny bit of iser, it's permitted. And there's a very long taz on this where he points out that the car of this rule comes from this Gemara about using these like casks that the Ovdei Kochavim had of wine, right? And he says it's not clear if this would be a paradigm for other things because other drinks, other liquids with wine become pagum, right? So he's like, you could easily say that this only applies in scenarios where the iser is also pagum, right? And what the Taz ends up paskening is that you should only apply this heter if it's a kli gadol and it's that is pagum, right? Because then it's several steps away from any scenario where there would be an asur netinat tam, right? Because it's a devar mu'at and it's something that even had it given flavor in some way, it would be a negative one, right? But he says even with a kli gadol, if it like with a ben yomo thing that wouldn't be a pagum flavor, it's forbidden to use lechatchila heter in that thing. Okay.
And why is this sif in this siman?
Because so actually that's part of what he brings in is you might have thought that this is an example of mavatalis or lechatchila, right? Like if I tell you, oh yeah, you're lechatchila allowed to use that massive pot that absorbs a tiny bit of iser, you might say, aren't I just like mivateling the iser? And the answer is no, because here it's not that there was an iser and you're making it irrelevant. It's that it never becomes aser, right? That like there's so that like yefshar lavo lidei netinat tam, right? It's not that there's like going to be some kind of recognizable tam that we then make irrelevant. It's that there's no scenario in which that tam will ever even become recognizable in heter such that it would be aser in the first place.
I like the point that it's also because it's pogam.
Right, so that's part of the Taz says like that gives us so many levels away, right? That's so many levels away from like any kind of actually properly usher food. And he does point out again that like pagum is not a thing that you can rely on lechatchila, right? Like you're not actually allowed to just like a properly extremely treif Eno ben yomo kli. You're not allowed to just lichatchila decide to cook in it because it would be pagum. But that the pagum combined with the mashihu, right? It's pagum, and also it's a tiny, tiny bit that is not going to give any flavor probably at all. But these multiple considerations are enough to allow this lichatchila.
Lexie. This is you did a great job. This is a complicated second half of this this Siman is extremely complicated and very important. It has a lot of details. We did we could spend 4 lessons on this Siman easily. So bear that in mind when you review things. This is an important Siman in the sense that it's complex. The next Siman that we're going to do is actually not so complex. Although there's, so it's actually a kind of a lightweight Siman in comparison to the previous 2, actually. And it's short. Let's take a break for 5 minutes, and then we'll start with the next Siman with the source sheet that I sent out.